On the 11th of April 1933, a British pioneering aviator by the name of Bill Lancaster took off in his Aviation plane with the intention of breaking the world record for flying between London and Cape Town in southern Africa. As the Aviation was considerably slower than other aircraft of the time, Lancaster would have to make very short stops and get very little sleep to have any hope of achieving the record. Having got lost several times, and having not slept for 30 hours, as well as being 10 hours behind his intended time, Lancaster took off from Ragan in central Algeria on the evening of the 12th of April to make a 750-mile night crossing of the Sahara. The Aviation's engine failed after less than an hour's flying, and he crash-landed in the desert far north of his expected flight path. Relatively unscathed and occasionally firing flares, he awaited a hoped-for rescue. Searches were too far to the south, and a car searching from Ragan was also unsuccessful. He died 8 days later, on the 20th of April. His final message, written on a fuel card, was, "So the beginning of the 8th day has dawned. It is still cool. I have no water. I am waiting patiently. Come soon, please. Fever racked me last night. Hope you get my full logbook. Bill." He died 1 year to the day that his friend had been murdered in dubious circumstances. This is the story of the Love Triangle murder. Bill Lancaster was born in Birmingham at the turn of the century, and he emigrated to Australia prior to World War I. In 1916, he joined first the Australian Army and later the Australian Flying Corps. He remained in Britain after the war and joined the Royal Air Force, marrying Annie Besant in 1919, with whom they had 2 children, and serving in India during the 1920s. He was promoted to flying officer from pilot officer in 1921. In 1927, he transferred to the RAF Reserve and decided to make a name for himself by flying from England to Australia. He was now separated from his wife, but was constrained by both family loyalty and their intensive religious beliefs from seeking a divorce. He met Jessie Miller, who had just arrived in London, seeking adventure and excitement, while her journalist husband, with whom she had an unhappy marriage, stayed at home in Australia. Bill had recently left the RAF and was seeking fame and fortune, as he had a wife and children to provide for at home. Inspired by Charles Lindbergh's remarkable recent solo flight to Paris, Bill wanted to set his own record, flying from England to Australia in a new light airplane called an Aviation. Over drinks at a party, Bill told Jessie of his plan, and she talked of her own dreams of adventure and told him she wanted to join his. She became enthused with the idea of flying to Australia, and in effect she formed a business partnership with him. At the time, she had never flown in a plane in her life. Jessie's charm and persuasiveness, as well as her ability to raise money, sponsorship, and everything needed to actually make the flight, soon convinced a sceptical Bill to take her on. It was an astonishing plan that captivated the nation's imagination, and October the 14th, 1927, Bill and Jessie, with a farewell from Bill's wife, took off from London's Croydon Airport. They made this flight in an Aviation they called the Red Rose. It was at the time one of the longest flights made in such a small aircraft. It was the first England to Australia flight by a woman pilot. The intensity and danger of their experiences bonded the pair tightly together. And 6 weeks into their journey, after yet another close brush with death, Bill and Jessie collapsed into each other's arms. Perhaps inevitably, they had fallen in love. The trip had taken 6 months, and when Bill and Jessie finally arrived in Australia, after setting a new world record for distance flown in a light airplane, they were greeted by adoring crowds. Jessie's milestone achievements were even more remarkable. The longest flight ever made by a woman, the first woman to cross the equator in the air, and the first woman to fly more than 8,000 miles. A huge crowd greeted them on arrival in Darwin, and on their subsequent tour around Australia. They had become aviation's golden couple, and they had become lovers along the way, and not just business partners. But their love for each other remained a secret, and in the public eye they remained loving spouses to their partners back home. To capitalise on their newfound celebrity, Bill and Jessie sailed to Hollywood in June 1928 to star in a movie. But the Depression hit. The financing failed to materialise, and they relocated to New York to seek fresh opportunities. In 1929, Jessie became the third woman to earn a pilot's licence in New York, and one of just 34 licensed female pilots in the United States at that time. In 1930, she set a dual speed record for coast-to-coast flying in America. Yet life was tough, despite their achievements, and they ended up in Miami, where they decided their best shot at money was for Jessie to write her autobiography. A female pilot in those days was still a relative novelty, and Amelia Earhart had achieved great success with her own book about her exploits. Enter one, Haddon Clark. His mother had met Jessie socially and explained that her son was looking for work after losing his job at a magazine. She said that he would be delighted to write a book of her life. He moved into Bill and Jessie's rented Florida property at Coral Gable in order to assist with the writing of the book. He and Jessie had developed a relationship in Bill's absence, and Clark convinced Jessie to leave Bill and marry him instead. It was quite an interesting setup. The two men had shared a room whilst Jessie had her own bedroom. Interestingly, the men got on very well. Jessie, on the other hand, was becoming disappointed that Haddon never seemed to get down to actually typing up her life and times. During this period in 1932, Bill was becoming involved in a new venture called Latin American Airways. It was run by some individuals who wanted to use his services to transport illegal immigrants across the Mexican border, as well as marijuana. He refused and set off for St. Louis to raise more money for his own business of selling aircraft engines. In St. Louis, he received letters from both Haddon and Jessie. These confirmed rumours that instead of acting as friends, they were now lovers, and as Jessie was now single, they intended to marry each other. On the afternoon of the 19th of April, Bill arrived back in Miami and was greeted by the two lovers. Interestingly, that evening they resumed their previous sleeping arrangements, with the men in one bedroom and Jessie in the other. She acceded to Haddon's request to lock her bedroom door. In the small hours of the night, she was awakened by banging on the door and was told by Bill that Haddon had shot himself and had also left 2 suicide notes. Haddon was still alive, and the estranged couple had great difficulty finding a doctor or getting him to hospital. The next day he died. There were a number of rather puzzling aspects to this case. The gun in question was owned by Bill, and it was known that Haddon had an aversion to firearms. Haddon, whilst resenting the presence of Bill, had obviously won over Jesse. But more serious was the presence of the suicide notes, which the police discovered while searching the house. Most of it was typed, and the signatures were in pencil. The typing would appear to have been done by Bill. Also, the signatures did not tally with Haddon's genuine one. Jesse was soon ruled out, and the emphasis was now firmly on Bill. At first he was charged with conspiring with people behind Latin American Airways, but this was dropped as he was charged with a more serious offence of murder. If found guilty, he faced the electric chair. He contacted the state's attorney and confessed that he had drafted the suicide notes and not Haddon. The situation looked bleak for him, as he had shared a room with Haddon, lied about the suicide notes, owned the gun in question, and knew of the affair between Haddon and Jesse. There were bruises on the body that indicated some kind of fight before the killing, and his bed had not been slept in. But all was not lost. Bill's attorney, James Letheo, arranged for Jesse to see Miami's top defense attorney, Jim Carson. In reality, he was a sort of barrister, as he only accepted invitations to act from other attorneys, hence the call from James Letheo. He agreed to the request, but was horribly sceptical of success, given the forged suicide notes and the fact that Bill was a foreigner. Jesse prevailed upon him to see Bill, who convinced him of his innocence. Carson agreed to taking the case on two conditions. The body of Haddon, on application by the defence, must be exhumed and subject to an autopsy. The second was that, in the words of Carson, Jesse would be in the witness box and have to reveal everything about her relationship between the two men, which she agreed to, and on the 2nd of August 1932, the trial began. The defence was relying on one major issue. Haddon committed suicide as he was temperamental and unstable, drank heavily, smoked marijuana, and discussed suicide. Carson quickly dispensed with two rumours that had been widely reported in the press. The ambulance men took the body of Haddon down the stairs, could not recall whether it had been knocked into anything to cause bruises. The second is that Bill's bed had been messed up, to quote one witness, so the photograph of it by the police was useless. The trial started to unwind for the prosecution when they produced two witnesses from Latin American Airways who were currently facing charges for importing immigrants into the US, as well as marijuana for the booming San Francisco market. Their evidence was dismissed by the jury. Jessie had a rough time explaining her actions, but more importantly, spectators in the courthouse had changed from a lynch mob to actually cheering Bill as he outlined his defence to the prosecution. At one point, the judge threatened to clear the court because of their rowdy behaviour. But Carson was about to sabotage the reputation of the late Haddon Clark. While Haddon was wooing Jessie, he was forced to admit that he was cured of venereal disease. She was forced in the witness box to admit it, though she stated she was free of disease. Haddon was certainly a ladies' man, and aside from having up to 3 other girlfriends while staying at Coral Grove, he had a bigamous relationship with Virginia Clark, and a love letter from one Peggy Brown. But the evidence from some of his friends was devastating. Dick Lavender from New Orleans stated that they were drinking buddies, smoked marijuana, and that he stole money from Lavender's only source of revenue, the Veterans Bureau. Also, his attitude to the fairer sex was damning. as he claimed that he did not care whether you gave them a dose of syphilis or not. Again, he mentioned that if he committed suicide, it would be by a swift shot to the head. Another friend, called Richardson, was writing a play on Rasputin and visiting time to time Haddon at Coral Grove, where he noted that he was a heavy drinker and would occasionally help him out financially. Again, suicide was mentioned in their conversations. Carson played his masterstroke. He needed a ballistic witness, and he used the services of the renowned expert Dr. Albert Hamilton, and he was the go-to man for such advice. He produced the blackened skull of the late Haddon Clark to the jury, which clearly showed an entry wound, stating that there was but one conclusion, and only one conclusion, that could be arrived at, and that was the shot was self-inflicted. Close, hand-contact shot at the instant the gun was hard against the head, and the head was hard against the gun, adding that it was absolutely suicide. He said that there was not a scintilla of evidence to support a theory of murder. As the Dade County Medical Commission also agreed with the means of ending his life, there was little that the prosecution could do. Bill was released to huge cheers from spectators. The trial was extraordinary. Bill Lancaster had gone from being portrayed as a degenerate who was mixed up in an immigrant and drug smuggling racket, wanting to go home to Miami to kill Jesse's new lover, to an upstanding war veteran and a world-famous aviator who was being held back by divorce laws from marrying the woman he loved and being betrayed by his so-called friend, Haddon Clark. Nobody had a good word to say about Clark, and even his mother and brother never testified on his behalf. Even though Bill and Jesse had dissolved their romance and partnership, she spoke warmly in Lancaster's defence, and the trial judge gave a summing up in his favour. Bill was acquitted of murder after 5 hours of deliberation. It is regarded that although the evidence was in doubt, a major factor in the acquittal was his calm, straightforward, gentlemanly demeanour in the courtroom, and the portrayal of the victim as depressive, drug-addicted, and suicidal. Public opinion may also have played a part in influencing the jury. After the trial, Bill and Jesse agreed to leave the United States for Britain, with Bill leaving first. 2 months later he was joined by Jesse, and to avoid the press she was allowed to disembark prior to the liner docking. Bill went to live with his parents whilst Jesse stayed with an elderly aunt before securing a flat on the Edgware Road. Their financial prospects were very different. Jesse was able to secure the services of a ghostwriter for a series of articles, but never got to have her memoirs published. Bill, on the other hand, was having great difficulty finding work. It was widely felt that his acquittal regarding the death of Haddon Clark owed more to the strange world of American justice rather than good old-fashioned English law. In addition, he had not flown a plane for 12 months, 3 of which were spent in a Florida cell. His CV did not look good. Amy Johnson had just beaten the record of flying 6,300 miles from London to South Africa in a time of 4 days, 6 hours and 54 minutes. Bill decided that the only way to rehabilitate himself as a pilot was to beat that record and re-establish his reputation. He borrowed £700 from his father and bought an Avro Ariane and decided to emulate and beat the record. The big problem was that his plane was slower than that of the champion, and he would have to make more frequent stops en route. He got as far as French Saharan Africa and disappeared. Despite a frantic rescue effort spearheaded by Jesse from London, no trace of him could be found. For over 30 years he was undetected until a French patrol on the 12th of February 1962 came across the fuselage and his mummified corpse, and the story was back in the news when a platoon on a random journey through the desert came upon the wreckage of the plane with a pilot's skeletal body visible under the wing. Tied to the wreckage and encased in a waterproof envelope was the pilot's logbook, which he turned into a diary recounting the 8 days he'd spent dying in the desert and pouring out his love for the woman he had hoped to win back with this flight. A quick glance at the logbook showed the pilot's name, Bill Lancaster. Jesse stayed in the UK and got married in 1936. Just before the flight, Bill had made a will, making her the sole beneficiary.